I believe the polls and National and ACT will form the next government. Would it be a happy coalition? One area the two parties seem to differ wildly on is climate. ACT wants to slash and burn the Zero Carbon Act and a whole swathe of other initiatives. Their climate spokesperson, Simon Court, joins me now. Welcome to the program, Simon. Have you seen firsthand sort of the devastation of Cyclone Gabrielle?
Yes, I have been out to the west coast of Auckland and travelled to the Hawke's Bay a number of times to see what devastation has occurred after those phenomenal weather events.
Right, so you obviously still feel for the people who are homeless out there. If you were caught in that situation, you would be demanding action from government, wouldn't you, to help you out?
Yes, and ACT has received a number of representations from businesses and people affected.
Yeah.
And I also sat on the committee that considered the severe weather legislation in response to that bill.
Okay.
So we have tried to channel their concerns into a better outcome.
Okay, but see, if somebody's demanding action and they look at your policies, you have the least number of policies regarding climate change out of all the parties. That seems to go in the other direction, doesn't it?
Well, people in Hawke's Bay and in other parts of New Zealand hit by severe weather actually are demanding better infrastructure, that their councils and government deliver the climate adaptation response, because that's what affects communities.
But what about the other side, about reducing emissions, things like that? So they'll be saying, what are you doing to help us prevent this happening or mitigate that in the future with the reductions of emissions? And you have the least number of policies around that area.
Well, ACT supports the emissions trading scheme as the primary tool to reduce emissions. A government can cap New Zealand's emissions and then the emissions trading scheme sets a price. If people want to emit more, they have to pay for it. That's about $9 or $10 every time you fill up your car these days.
Yep.
And maybe adds, the same amount to a monthly power bill.
Okay, I'm going to get you...
There's the incentive.
That's the incentive. I'll get you to explain that a little bit more. First, I want to just clear up something for us. Does ACT support getting to net zero carbon emissions by 2050?
Look, if that's a goal that our top 5 trading partners have signed up to, then ACT believes New Zealand must play its part, and that would be the appropriate target.
So your policy is going to be set by other countries?
Well, we can't get ahead of other countries in terms of emissions reductions if it puts an excessive carbon price on our industries and on our households.
Didn't you say in Parliament recently that you supported net zero?
Yeah, net zero is an appropriate target, given that is what our trading partners have also adopted.
What about the laws passed here to get to that point, the Net Zero Carbon Act? Do you or do you not support that?
No, ACT does not support the Zero Carbon Act. It gives a climate minister the opportunity to interfere in every aspect of a person's life and what business does. ACT says we have the emissions trading scheme. It puts a price on carbon,
which you've said
Kiwis should choose.
Last week here we had a climate debate and National Simon Watts said you do support it. So let's just take a look at what he said. And so you're committed to the Net Zero Carbon Act as well?
Absolutely, and actually so as members of the ACT Party when we had a bill in front of the House this week when Simon Court in committee stage, and you were sitting in the chair, James, said that we support net zero.
So he was wrong?
If Simon Watts thinks that ACT supports a Zero Carbon Act, he is wrong. We don't need the Zero Carbon Act. It gives a minister like James Shaw the ability to set targets that are completely unrealistic, like cutting New Zealand's carbon emissions in half by 2030. If net zero is an appropriate target for our trading partners, why on earth do we need the Zero Carbon Act and a climate minister to set a target?
Well, because you need to set policies for your own country, not just base your policies on what other countries are doing. But we'll get to following other countries in a moment. I just want to clear up the politics around this first. You would repeal that Zero Carbon Act, but Christopher Luxon this week clearly said that he won't do that. So that's going to be a problem for coalition negotiations, is it?
Well, it won't be. If enough New Zealanders do want real change and they want practical climate policies that deliver adaptation to communities that need it, set a realistic price on carbon, and let Kiwis decide, then they should give their party vote to ACT.
Yeah, but that means that ACT would be the majority party, and that's not going to be beat National in terms of the party vote for you to get that through, because he's not going to do it.
ACT doesn't need to be a majority party. We just need enough MPs sitting around a cabinet table so that we can actually deliver real change for Kiwis.
Is climate a bottom line for ACT? Are you going to take that in there and say we're not going to budge?
Well, what ACT wants for New Zealanders is affordable climate policy, and I think we would get agreement around the cabinet table with National on that.
Right, but they say they're not going to repeal the Net Zero Carbon Act, which seems to be a bottom line for you guys.
Well, it's the Zero Carbon Act, and ACT says we don't need it because we can already set a price on carbon and
that's an issue.
Targets.
That's an issue between the two parties, isn't it?
Yeah, apparently it is right now, but we would...
You think you're going to change their mind?
Well, we would hope that voters who want real change would give their party vote to ACT, and with more ACT MPs sitting around the cabinet table, then ACT will have a bigger say in policy.
David Seymour said to me just recently, when I asked him about bottom lines, and he said it's things like the treaty and it's crime and it's school attendance. He didn't mention climate.
No, that's right. I mean, ACT is focused on delivering more affordable outcomes for Kiwis, resolving some of our long-term problems around education. If we don't solve the problem of Kiwi kids achieving highly in education, then New Zealand won't be succeeding in any measure.
So climate change is not a bottom line, but you're telling me that you may be able to influence their national party, which says that they're not going to repeal the Act.
Well, ACT has been very successful in influencing government and other parties' policies over the past 3 years. Every time we release a policy, what typically happens is 3 weeks to 3 months later, one of the other parties picks it up.
I don't think anybody's picking this one up. You're the outlier on this one. Anyway, look, this law that you want to repeal, at the moment it sets limits on how much carbon that New Zealand can produce in order to get to net zero. If you remove that plan, how do you reduce emissions under your plan?
Well, emissions will reduce over time as the technology becomes available. So the government has set a target under the Zero Carbon Act, an emissions reduction, of reducing vehicle kilometres travelled by 20% by 2035.
So that's,
it's a completely unnecessary target.
You don't
and
like
if I
that.
could just, if I could just explain why.
Yeah.
It's because the auto manufacturers came to Parliament's Transport Committee and told parliamentarians that they're only going to be producing low emissions and zero carbon vehicles by 2030. There won't be any other vehicles to buy. So
there are vehicles
New Zealand doesn't need to set targets that are unrealistic and simply add cost to Kiwis now when technology will solve a lot of these things.
That doesn't sound right. Because, you know, in New Zealand, in June, 1 in 2 new cars was an EV bought. So, you know, there are cars there to buy.
Well, there will be a lot more. Currently, EVs only make up a very small proportion of our new vehicle fleet, but by 2030, that'll be all that's rolling off.
Well, the market seems to be responding to the sort of the subsidies and the initiatives, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, this government has overdone its subsidies. They've spent hundreds of millions of dollars more handing out money to Kiwis to buy Teslas and other EVs than they've even been able to collect. This is going to deliver another fiscal hole, another budget shortfall for whichever government comes next.
And it's also reduced emissions at the same time.
No, it hasn't reduced emissions at all. That's because the government sets a cap on overall emissions, and if emissions are reduced by somebody buying an EV, it simply frees them up to be emitted somewhere else in the economy. That's the beauty of the emissions trading scheme. It actually sets a price on emissions.
All right, well, let's talk about that.
Choose.
So you want us to set a price following one of our 5 major trading partners, don't you? That's ACT's policy.
Well, ACT wants to tie our emissions reduction targets to those achieved by our top 5 trading partners, because all kinds of climate ministers have gone to conference and announced targets, but
let's talk about your
countries
policies.
Are struggling to achieve them.
So, I mean, which major trading partner are you going to follow? Because they're all different. You know, they all have different prices. China is $9 a tonne of carbon. Australia, $30. Korea, $5. The EU is about $100. It's all over the place. Why can you not set your own path as a country?
Well, New Zealand should set its own path.
Yeah.
It should be a realistic emissions reduction target that actually matches that of our top 5 trading partners.
But they're all over the place. You can't match any of those.
But here's the thing. If we set a carbon price that is much, much higher than our trading partners, which is what the Climate Change Commission and James Shaw have insisted that we do in the past couple of years, all that's going to do is put a much higher price on what New Zealanders produce. Either that means that we export jobs and
our fourth largest trading partner, the EU, has a price of about $100 on carbon. That's more than double ours.
Yeah, but they don't put a price on transport emissions. So if we just come back to what ACT would do and what the benefits are, by adopting the same carbon emissions reduction as our top 5 trading partners, then New Zealand businesses and New Zealand consumers would be in the same place relatively to consumers in those countries. Otherwise, we risk this thing called carbon leakage, which we put a much higher price on carbon than our trading partners. Our businesses, our highly skilled, highly paid jobs simply leave New Zealand. We import the same products, but with higher emissions.
OK, all right. Well, we've run out of time. There was a good run through ACT's policies there on climate. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Climate spokesperson for ACT, Simon Court.